This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will dismantle one of the most damaging lies the productivity world has ever sold you. That motivation is the starting point, that you need to feel it first, that the energy, the drive, the fire in the chest that makes action feel inevitable, that this feeling is what has to arrive before the work can begin, that the people who execute consistently are the ones who have somehow cracked the code on feeling motivated more often, more intensely, and more reliably than the rest of us. I believed this for most of my adult life, and it cost me years I will never get back. Because I spent those years waiting for the feeling to arrive, waiting to feel ready, waiting for the morning I would wake up and the resistance would be gone and the path forward would feel clear and the work would flow the way it did on the rare days when everything aligned and execution felt effortless. Those mornings came, occasionally, unpredictably, and never when I needed them most. And on every other morning, which was most mornings, I did what people who are waiting for motivation do. I prepared to work instead of working. I planned instead of executed. I reorganized, researched, reconsidered, and told myself that tomorrow, when I felt more ready, the real work would begin. Tomorrow arrived, with the same resistance, the same absence of the feeling I was waiting for, and the same result. If you are living in that loop right now, if your execution is hostage to a feeling that comes and goes without warning, then what I am about to share is the most important conversation you will have this week. Because the research on this is not ambiguous. And once you understand what actually drives execution, not what feels like it should drive it, but what the science consistently shows actually does, you will never wait for motivation the same way again. I want to take you back to the lowest period of my rebuilding years, somewhere in the middle of 2013. I had come through the collapse of the business. I had done enough of the psychological work to understand, at least intellectually, what had gone wrong. I had a clear enough picture of what needed to happen next. I had the plan. I had the intention. I had, on paper, everything required to begin executing. What I did not have, on most mornings, was the feeling, the drive, the fire, the sense of momentum and possibility that I had experienced in the early days of building the first business and that I was convinced I needed to recreate before I could build the next thing. I would sit at my desk in the morning and wait for it. I would drink the coffee and read something inspiring and review the vision and wait for the feeling to show up and carry me into the work. Some mornings it came, and on those mornings I was extraordinary. I would execute for hours with a clarity and energy that felt almost effortless. I would end those days with genuine satisfaction and the quiet conviction that I had finally turned a corner. And then, the next morning, the feeling would be gone again, and I would be back at the desk, waiting. There was a period of about 4 months where my actual output, the work that was building the new business, was almost entirely determined by how I felt when I woke up. Good feeling day, strong output, flat feeling day, reorganized the filing system and called it productive. I was not building a business, I was building a mood-dependent illusion of one. The shift came from an unexpected direction. Not from a new motivational framework or a better morning routine or a clearer vision. It came from a conversation with a physiotherapist, a woman named Dr. Serena, who was helping me recover from a back injury I had developed from, ironically, sitting at a desk doing nothing for too many hours. I was complaining to her one afternoon, not about the back, but about the motivation problem, about waiting for the feeling, about the inconsistency between the days it showed up and the days it didn't. She looked at me with the calm pragmatism of someone who spent her days helping people move bodies that did not want to move, and said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Oscar, I have never once met a patient who felt like doing their rehabilitation exercises. Not one. The ones who recover are not the ones who eventually feel like doing them. They are the ones who do them before the feeling arrives and discover that the feeling follows the movement, not the other way around." I sat with that for a long time, and then I went looking for the science behind what she had just described. The research I found, and it is some of the most practically important research in all of behavioral psychology, fundamentally dismantled the model of motivation I had been operating on for my entire adult life. The model most of us carry looks like this. Motivation arrives, action follows, results emerge. Simple, linear, and almost completely wrong. The model the research actually supports looks like this. Action begins. Motivation follows. Results emerge. The sequence is inverted from everything we were taught to believe. The first and most foundational research here comes from Dr. Timothy Pychyl at Carleton University. whose work on procrastination and motivation I have referenced before on this channel. Pychyl spent decades studying the relationship between mood, motivation, and action, and arrived at a conclusion that is simultaneously obvious in retrospect and almost completely counter to how most people operate. He found that motivation is not a precondition for action. It is a consequence of action. The emotional state we call motivation, the felt sense of drive, engagement, and momentum, is generated by the act of beginning, not by anything that happens before it. Pychyl calls this the action-mood connection, and his research shows it operates with extraordinary reliability, not just occasionally, not just for certain types of people, but as a fundamental feature of how the human motivational system actually works. You do not think your way into motivated action. You act your way into motivated thinking. This finding is supported by the neuroscience of Dr. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford University, whose decades of research on dopamine and motivation produced a finding that should permanently change how you think about getting started. Sapolsky found, and this is critical, that dopamine, the brain's primary motivation chemical, does not spike at the moment of reward. It spikes in anticipation of reward. And more specifically, his research showed that dopamine begins to release the moment an action is initiated, the moment the behavior begins, not before it. What this means neurologically is that the motivational energy you are waiting to feel before you start is actually generated by the act of starting itself. You cannot access the neurochemical state of motivation from the outside of the behavior. You can only access it from the inside of it. The brain releases the motivational fuel once the engine is already running, not to start it. This is one of the most practically important findings in modern neuroscience for anyone trying to build consistent execution, and almost nobody talks about it. The second body of research I want to bring into this conversation comes from Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist at Claremont Graduate University, whose landmark work on what he called the flow state produced one of the most detailed maps of peak human performance ever constructed. Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying the conditions under which human beings experience what he called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging activity where effort feels effortless, time distorts, and performance reaches its highest levels. Most people assume that flow is something that arrives from the outside, that you either get lucky and fall into it, or you don't. Csikszentmihalyi's research showed the opposite. Flow is not a random visitation. It is a state that is reliably produced by specific conditions, and the most critical of those conditions is simply beginning the activity and sustaining engagement with it past the initial resistance. His research showed that the entry point into flow is almost always uncomfortable. The first minutes of engagement with any cognitively demanding task typically feel effortful, resistive, and unrewarding. This is what Csikszentmihalyi called the activation energy barrier, the initial cost of engagement that must be paid before the flow state becomes accessible. The people who experience flow consistently are not the ones who feel motivated before they start. They are the ones who have learned to push through the activation energy barrier, to begin and sustain engagement past the initial discomfort, until the intrinsic reward of the activity itself takes over and carries them forward. The feeling you are waiting for before you start, that feeling lives on the other side of starting, not before it. This connects directly to the work of B.J. Fogg at Stanford, whose behavioral research I have discussed before on this channel, and his finding that the single greatest predictor of whether a behavior is initiated is the amount of friction standing between the person and the beginning of the behavior. Fogg's research showed that motivation is not what overcomes friction. Motivation is what is generated once friction has been reduced enough to allow action to begin. His practical prescription, which maps directly onto everything Pychyl and Sapolsky found, is to reduce the activation energy of the behavior to the smallest possible starting point, not to wait until you feel motivated enough to do the full behavior, but to make the entry point so small, so low friction, so neurologically cheap that beginning requires almost nothing, and then allow the motivational state to build from inside the action. There is also critical research here from William James, the founding father of American psychology, who articulated this principle a century before the neuroscience existed to confirm it. James wrote that action seems to follow feeling, but really action and feeling go together. And by regulating the action, which is under the more direct control of the will, we can indirectly regulate the feeling, which is not. In plain language, James was saying exactly what Pychyl, Sapolsky, and Fogg's research has now confirmed in precise neurological detail. You cannot directly control how motivated you feel, but you can control whether you begin, and beginning is what produces the feeling. The final researcher I want to bring into this conversation is Dr. Carol Dweck, whose work on identity and mindset I have covered on this channel before. Dweck's research contains a finding that is directly relevant to the motivation question that most discussions of her work miss entirely. She found that people with a growth mindset, the orientation toward ability as developable rather than fixed, do not wait to feel capable before attempting difficult things. They have developed what she calls a challenge response, rather than a threat response to difficult tasks. And that challenge response is not something they were born with. It was built through repeated experiences of beginning things in the absence of certainty and discovering that the capability emerged from the attempt rather than preceding it. The people who execute consistently are not the ones who feel more motivated than you. They are the ones who have, through experience and deliberate practice, built a different relationship with the absence of motivation. They have learned, at the level of felt experience, that the feeling follows the action. And so the absence of the feeling before they begin has stopped being a reason not to start. Here is the practical framework I want you to build from everything the research points to. 3 components, each one directly addressing a different layer of the motivation weighting problem. The first is what I call the 2-minute ignition. Drawing directly from Fogg's friction research and Pychyl's action mood findings, your only commitment when motivation is absent is to begin the behavior for 2 minutes. Not to complete it, not to do it well, not to feel good about it, simply to initiate contact with the work for 2 minutes and nothing beyond that. Fogg's research shows that the motivational state generated by 2 minutes of initiated behavior is almost always sufficient to carry the action forward past the 2-minute point. The brain, once past the activation energy barrier, generates enough intrinsic reward from the activity itself to sustain engagement. But the 2-minute commitment removes the psychological weight of the full behavior from the decision to begin. You are not deciding to do an hour of deep work. You are deciding to open the document and engage with it for 2 minutes. That decision is almost always available to you, regardless of how you feel. The second component is what Gulwitzer's implementation intention research prescribes, a pre-written if-then response specifically designed for the moment motivation is absent, not a general intention to work when you feel like it. A specific plan that fires automatically when the feeling is not there. Write this sentence and place it somewhere you will see it during your most important execution window. If I sit down to work and feel no motivation whatsoever, then I will open the work, set a timer for 2 minutes, and begin without waiting for the feeling to arrive. That pre-written response removes the in-the-moment negotiation between your motivated self and your unmotivated self. The decision has already been made. The feeling doesn't get a vote. The third component addresses the identity layer that underlies the motivation weighting pattern. Because at a deeper level, waiting for motivation before acting is a statement about identity. It is the behavioral expression of the belief that you are someone who needs to feel ready before you can begin. And as Mac Adams's research on narrative identity showed, behavior consistently confirms the self-narrative that generates it. So write one sentence that reframes the identity. Not I am someone who executes when motivated, but I am someone who begins before the motivation arrives because I know the motivation follows the beginning. Read it before your most important work window every day. Not as an affirmation, as a behavioral instruction to your nervous system about who you are and how you operate. 3 components: the 2-minute ignition, the if-then pre-commitment, the identity reframe, built once, used every day, especially on the days the feeling doesn't show up. I want to close with something that I think about often. I wasted years of my life waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive on schedule, never going to come when I needed it most, never going to be reliable enough to build anything real on. And the tragedy, the part that still sits uncomfortably when I think about it honestly, is that the feeling was available to me almost every single day. It was waiting on the other side of 2 minutes of initiated action. Reliably, consistently, almost without exception. I just never knew that. Because nobody told me the sequence was inverted. Motivation is not the ignition. It is the fuel that the engine generates once it is already running. You do not need to feel it to begin. You need to begin to feel it. Stop waiting. Open the work. Set the timer. Give it 2 minutes. Everything the research points to says the feeling will meet you there. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.